Well, good morning again, everyone. As I said, we're going to begin a new series today. It is important, and I just want you to track the thinking of this. It is important, periodically, for a church family like this one, for a gathering of believers, wherever they might be around this world, to take the time to stop for a moment and begin to ask and answer the question, what are we all about? What is this church about? It requires a lot of reflection, and it requires asking and exploring some tough questions. Sometimes we don't want to do that, but we need to do that. And the most important part of this whole process, what you're really after as you do this, is to understand what the will of the Lord is. To understand how God is working and desire to work among His people. I think you see this process in the book of Revelation. Chapter 2 and 3 of Revelation are a series of brief letters, really brief statements, to 7 different churches throughout the area that would be Turkey today. And as these sort of statements come from John, who's seeing these visions and telling each of these churches, the church of Smyrna this, the church of Pergamum this, he always ends after he said what he said with something along the lines of, for anyone who has ears to hear, meaning anybody who's willing, anybody who's open to Jesus, anyone who has ears to hear, let that person hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Whose church is it? Is it my church as a pastor? Is it your church as a people? It's Jesus' church. We are the church. It's not a building. It's not an organization. It's not a service. It is you. You're the church, and you belong to Jesus. You are His very own, and He bought you with the blood that He shed on that cross. And so we want to understand what the Spirit of God is saying to the church. And I want to tell all of you that First Baptist Church is about to enter into this process. For the next several months, we're going to begin to do some reflection, and we're going to begin to ask some questions, because we want to understand, what are we all about at this time, in this valley, in this fellowship's history? What are we about? What is Jesus saying to the church? And you can't get that if you're not willing to stop and reflect and ask questions. You can't get that for your personal life. You can't get that for your fellowship's life. You have to be willing to engage Jesus in the process. You have to be willing and somewhat courageous to enter the process and say, okay, Lord, here we are. What are we about? What are you wanting to do among us? What is this all about? And then as He tells you, He begins to reveal, because He wants us to understand that. Then we begin by faith to follow. And honestly, it is a faith process to just sit down and ask the Lord what He wants to do. So I thought it would be a great idea, and I'm pretty excited about it actually, for us as a church fellowship to do a study, to look at the book of the New Testament that has the most to say about the church that Jesus is building, and that's the book of Ephesians. Now, you're going to see some things that maybe you have read but never really thought through. The way Paul, I believe Paul wrote it, we'll talk about this in a minute, the way Paul, as the Spirit of God has worked in him and speaks through him, is writing these things down, in my opinion, is unlike what we really see, other than a glimpse here and a glimpse there. You know, there's vast amounts of churches in the United States, vast amounts of wealth being poured into that. I mean, cutting-edge technology, all kinds of stuff. But in my opinion, and we'll go over it and you can make up your own minds, I don't think we really see the fullness at all of who we are in Jesus Christ, what a fellowship of people really is, and of how God wants us to walk that out. That's what I think. And so we're going to go through this book, and then we're going to talk about it, and you can kind of come to the conclusions as you pray about it and think through it. And we study this book. Now, the book begins like this. As all of Paul's letters do, there is a brief greeting. But this greeting is different, and I'll show you how it's different in a moment. So the greeting begins up on the screen. This is how it begins. Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, by the will of God. To God's holy people in Ephesus, the faithful in Christ Jesus, grace and peace to you from God, our Father, and the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, whenever you study a book of the Bible, you need to ask it 4 important questions. You need to ask the question, who wrote it? And what do I know about the person who wrote it? What can I understand about who that person is, what they're all about, and how that comes into their writing? Who wrote it? Then you have to say, who was it written to? Who are the recipients of this letter? And what do I know about them? And specifically, what do I know about their particular situation at that moment in history within the culture that they lived in? That's a second very important question to ask. The third question is, why was the letter written in the first place? What is the purpose of the letter? We talk about, as we're going through Bible study, the occasion. In other words, what was the situation that caused the apostle, whoever might have written the book, to say, I need to write to that church at wherever, Philippi, wherever it might be. I need to write to that church and address those specific issues in the name of the Lord Jesus. So you'll see if you read, and I know you guys spend a lot of time reading theological journals, but if you read some of the older theological journals and books and stuff, you'll see a German phrase that comes up over and over, sitz im Leben, which just means the situation in life. What was happening? What is the contextual stuff going on that's happening that the apostle feels he needs to address? Purpose. And the fourth thing is, what is the subject? How does he address it? What does he talk about? What is the primary subject that he's talking about? And then as he gives the subject, then he'll begin to explain what he wants to say about that subject. Sometimes in theological writing, he'll talk about the subject and the complement. The subject is so-and-so, and the complement is what it has to say about so-and-so. So we're going to look at those 4 things. So let's begin. Now, I've called this sermon a book with no name. You'll see why. The first thing we need to ask is, who is the author? Who wrote this book? Now, we know, and most historians agree, although there's a little bit of debate that it's not well-founded, that it was written by a man who lived in the first century, whose name was Paul, who was an apostle. But what we need to understand is he wasn't just any apostle, he was specifically the apostle to the Gentiles. The apostle to the Gentiles. Now this is huge, because all of the apostles, they thought in the beginning, were sent to the Jewish nation. And so someone who was a Jew among Jews like Paul, who was specifically called by God to break out of the Jewish nation, to go to what they thought were the heathen, the ungodly, and to take the message of Jesus, that is vast. And it flavors everything he talks about. It fills his mind. It fills his actions. He continually talks about, almost boasts about being the apostle to the Gentiles. Not that he's arrogant about it, but he so has grabbed hold of the call God has for him that it consumes him. And that is going to be throughout this book. The idea that the apostles are part of what God is doing, that the Gentiles are part of what God is doing on earth. Now look what he says. Jump to chapter 3. And this actually falls in something we're going to be talking about later on, which is known as a Pauline, from Paul, digression. In other words, he starts talking about something, and then he just can't help himself, and he veers off and he explains something in great detail, gets all the way down the line, and he goes, oh yeah, and comes back and keeps talking about the thing he was talking about in the first one. But look what he says. Ephesians 3. Although I am less than the least of all the Lord's people. Now he says that because before he came to Christ, he was authorized by the Jewish leadership to go out to round up Christians, predominantly Jewish Christians, and have them arrested for heresy, and in some cases have them killed. So he says, I'm the least of the Lord's people. This grace was given to me to preach to the Gentiles the boundless riches of Christ. This consumes him. It's what he's all about. And to make plain to everyone the administration of this mystery, meaning the details of it, which for ages past was kept hidden in God, who created all things. So do you see where he's coming from? He cannot contain himself. He understands that before, God didn't say something, and I'll show you a verse in a minute, but God didn't reveal everything exactly. But when he finally said yes to Jesus, and he stepped into his calling, follow this. He said yes to Jesus. He didn't say, I'd rather not do that. I would rather follow the path I was on. You know, he was on the path to become the teacher in all of the nation of Israel. The number one teacher, the great professor of the law. And he said no to that in favor of saying yes to Jesus on the road to Damascus. And then God slowly brings him into what he's going to do with his life. He is going to tell the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people, that I love them too, and that I want them to be part of what I'm doing on earth. It's amazing what he's called to do. Now, what's the mystery? Look up on the screen. He tells us a few verses earlier in chapter 3. This mystery is that through the Gentiles, the Gentiles are heirs together with Israel, members together of one body. They'll call that the church later, and it shares together in the promise of Christ Jesus. Now that aspect of who he is and what he's all about is going to flavor this whole book. Do you see, just as he lays it down, this is the most important thing. He literally will die for this. He'll die for this. Because they will say, you need to stop preaching. He'll go to prison twice, at least, that we know of. And the final time, under Emperor Nero, he'll be put on the chopping block. They'll kill him. He'll do it because making it known to the Gentiles is all he cares about. Because who else on planet Earth gets to do that but the great Apostle Paul at that moment in history? Peter did a little bit. Some of the other apostles that fought did. Legend says certain apostles went certain places. But we know for sure that Paul was the one called predominantly to do this. When you say yes to Jesus, in favor of saying no to my ideas, no to my concerns, no to my preferences, no to my thoughts, okay, Jesus, I'll just trust you. When you say yes to Jesus and embrace what he has for you, he will use you in ways beyond what you can possibly ever understand. Somebody say amen to that. Still a Baptist church, right? Amen. Amen. Help me, Baptists. Amen. He will use you, and that's Paul. Paul is an example of that. The key is saying yes. As we enter the process of asking what we're all about, to say yes as God begins to guide us. Now, who is this letter written to? Well, the easy answer is, well, it's to the Ephesians. But here's the problem. This is not easy to answer. It's not easy at all, which is why I call this a book with no name. Or rather, it should be a book without the name Ephesians. Here's the problem. Where it says, to God's holy people in Ephesus. If you were to look at the oldest manuscripts, and particularly right now, I'm thinking of Papyrus 46. Everybody say Papyrus 46. Wow, you have not yet gotten the name in first year Bible college. Papyrus 46 is one of the oldest manuscripts we have, an extant, meaning it's still around manuscript. Dates to the 2nd century, maybe less than 100 years after these words were penned that we're reading. It was copied onto Papyrus 46. Contains a lot of the New Testament. It's very old. Older than other documents, other manuscripts. Roughly 1,000, 1,500 Greek manuscripts we still have. Somewhere between 50,000 in other languages. So, it's very old. In Papyrus 46, when it says, to God's holy people, it doesn't say in Ephesus. It just says, to God's holy people. Later on, tradition and legend says that was in Ephesus, so they called it to the Ephesians, or in Ephesus, and called the book Ephesians. In other words, something in our Bible was added later, because that's what people thought should be there. But it's misleading. Originally, it wasn't there. There's something else that's interesting. You look at all of Paul's letters, and they all address a general concern, a local problem that some group of believers in some city, town, or village is having. Ephesians has none of that. There is no specific problem. In the occasion for writing. It doesn't exist. He doesn't say, so you Ephesians, you really need to deal with this. All of those other letters have that. This one does not. And if he was writing specifically to Ephesus, that would be there. Here's another issue. You get to the end of his epistles, his letters, and he greets all the people that live in that town that are people that are kind of been helpers to his, or he'll talk to specific people about issues they're having. And he'll say, greet so-and-so, and all the people who meet in that woman's house, the church that gathers in that house, greet them all in the name of the Lord Jesus. Oh, greet my fellow worker so-and-so, who was so helpful when I was in Rome. Greet him too, he's there. That doesn't exist. There is no greetings, specific greetings at the end of this book. It's not to Ephesus. It probably shouldn't be called Ephesians. In a sense, it's a book with no name. So who is it to? Let me give you a scenario. And I'm drawing something. It's a big mystery. Paul writes this book around 61 AD. He's in prison in Rome for preaching the gospel. His house prison, people come and go out of his house. It's a quarters that he actually rents. People bring him food. People come to talk about Jesus. The Jews come to try and corner him. He's in this prison for a couple of years, this house arrest. As he's there, a man named Onesimus, who is from the city of Colossae, who was a runaway slave. Now, slavery is very different in the first century than it is now. He's a runaway slave. He comes to Paul. Their paths cross. And Onesimus comes to Jesus Christ. Paul begins to pray for him and minister to him, and they come to the conclusion that the right thing, what Jesus is wanting Onesimus to do, is to go back to his master. Can you imagine? Now, Onesimus is going to say yes to Jesus, accept that calling, and there's going to be an inspired book that will last through the generations called Philemon in the Bible. When we say yes to God, even if it's not our preference, God does big things. I don't want you to miss that reality. So, Paul recognizes this is very touchy because he believes Philemon needs to begin to treat Onesimus like a brother, not a slave, because Onesimus is a believer in Jesus, and so is Philemon. So he writes a little letter that we call Philemon. And he calls another man named Tacitus, who is a worker with him in his apostolic ministry. And he says, I want you to accompany Onesimus back. This is frightening. Runaway slave and all. I want you to go back and stand up for Onesimus. Stand in his ground with him. And I've written a letter and I want you to deliver it. Now, the way they would go from Rome to Colossae is they would go down to southern Italy, the southeastern portion, and would take a ship to Ephesus. In Ephesus, they would follow the main Roman road through that part, the province of Asia, and they would hit cities along the way until they got to Colossae. So Paul decides, as long as you're going that way, I want to write another letter to send with you. You're going to accompany Onesimus. You're going to stand up for him. You're going to deliver this letter to Philemon, his master, to tell him to treat him like a brother in Jesus. As long as you're going, I want to send a letter. And this letter now is going to be a letter that he wants him to take to the city of Ephesus, where Paul spent 2.5 years. And then he wants him to take it to other cities, even Colossae and other cities around this area. So who is this letter really written to? Who are the recipients? The recipients are the churches of Asia. The Roman province, Asia. Don't think Asia as we have it on our map now. The Roman province of Asia, which would be the southern western part of the church. I think I got a map up here. Got a map? So if you see down in Ephesus, that is the seaport that they would have sailed into where he would have first taken the letter. It is what's known as an encyclical, a generalized letter that's meant to go from city to city to city. Then they would go to Colossae, where he would talk with Philemon, and then the letter would go up to Laodicea, and 3 or 4 other places. It's a letter to the churches in that area. Now, look at the book of Colossians. Because he also sends a letter to Colossae. Because he heard through Titus, and probably had it confirmed through Onesimus, that there was starting to be some pretty wacky teaching in Colossae. People were saying stuff like you have to worship angels because they're emanations from God, and that's the only way to get to God. It's the precursor to what would be called the 2nd century Gnosticism. So he writes to address that. Look what he says in the end of Colossians. Up on the screen, chapter 4. Give my greetings to the brothers and sisters in Laodicea. This is a letter that goes to Colossae specifically. And to Nymphia and the church in her house. She's a faithful sister who lets people gather in her home to worship. After this letter has been read to you, letter Colossians, what we call Colossians, see that it is also read in the church of the Laodiceans, and that you in turn read the letter from Laodicea. It is very possible that the letter from Laodicea is what we call Ephesians. It's not meant to be just to Ephesus. It is a generalized letter. Now, Paul did have a purpose. So what was his purpose? When you begin to understand what Paul was like when you read the book of Acts, and he goes from town to town to town, telling them about Jesus, predominantly Gentile cities and towns. And then he goes back and he visits them again to build them up, to strengthen them in their faith. That's what this letter of Ephesians is all about. The purpose of this letter is to encourage those churches, to build them up in their faith, to strengthen them in their trust of Jesus. He knows the kind of persecution that's coming and that they're already facing. He knows what is happening as they go along in their life day to day, the kinds of crazy teaching that is in Colossae. He understands the issues that they're going to have and are currently having. And so he sends the letter to encourage them. Look how he ends the book here. In Ephesians chapter 6, final chapter, he says, Tychicus, the dear brother and faithful servant in the Lord, will tell you everything, so that you also may know how I am and what I am doing. They're concerned because he was in Roman prison. I am sending him to you for this very purpose, that you may know how we are, and that he may encourage you. Paul is all about encouragement, about building them up. Encouraging just means to strengthen them in their faith. And as you go through this letter, unlike his other letters, this one's filled with praise for God. Look what God has done. Look at how he's built us up. Look at what he's doing throughout the church. Look at all these things. It's filled with prayers. All these prayers he's praying for them. He wants them to know that he's constantly lifting them up. If you're ever going to go through something difficult and have someone say, I'm praying for you every day. And you go, that's good. Thank you. Knowing someone is truly praying for you. Now, don't say it unless you're doing it. But knowing someone is truly praying for you makes all the difference in the world. Having somebody pat you on the shoulder and say, I'm praying for you, brother. You know they're not. That's just frustrating. But when there's a faithful saint, like many of you, like the Apostle Paul, who says, you are in my prayers, strengthens you. Because you know people are at warfare with you in this issue you're facing. And that's what Paul is doing. He wants to build them up. He wants to strengthen them. So the letter's full of praise to God, which, by the way, worship strengthens the church. When we worship Jesus, it strengthens us. It's full of all the prayers for them. It's almost, you could say, liturgical. Almost like going through a worship service as you read the letter of Ephesians. Now, the fourth thing is the subject. What is the subject? How does he build them up? What is he going to focus on? Well, I already kind of said it, but I want to say it differently. The subject of the book of Ephesians is the greatness of the church. The greatness of the church. Now, that sounds strange when every year there are hundreds of thousands of Americans who stop attending their local church. And there's all kinds of reasons. About 2/3 of those people, when they leave their local church, leave the faith. About a third of those people continue in the faith and just say something along the lines of, I just wasn't finding, the Lord where I was attending or something like that. So there's all kinds of reasons that people have. Sometimes they're offended or something. But there's all sorts of reasons for that. The reality is there are a lot of people leaving the church of Jesus. And so to say the greatness of the church seems almost odd. But the reality is, and I'll say this many times, and you'll see this as we go through Ephesians, next to the Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit, next to the Trinity, the church of Jesus Christ is the greatest thing in all creation. Now, you may not feel that, you may not see that, you may question that, you may doubt that. But the book of Ephesians lays it out, and as we go through it and you see what the church is really meant to be and do, you will say, oh my, if we would let God do this in us, we would be unstoppable. It would turn hearts and minds of women and men and children to Jesus by the millions. It is what Jesus made us to be. It's not often what we allow ourselves to be. Our fears get in the way. Our biases get in the way. Our preferences get in the way. Our very limited, finite mindsets get in the way. So we're going to look at Ephesians. Look at what he says again. Chapter 3, which is part of this digression I was telling you about. He says his intent, talking about God, his intent was that now, meaning this period of history, what Paul and the others would call the final days, or the last days before Jesus returns, started back after the resurrection and is going to this day, this moment in history. His intent was that now, through the church, I didn't say the church in Ephesus, he's talking about the body of believers on earth, of which you are a part. Through the church, the manifold wisdom of God should be made known to the rulers and authorities in heavenly realms, according to his eternal purpose that he accomplished in Christ Jesus our Lord. Do you hear what he's saying? He's saying that God, through the church, shows his wisdom to all the forces out there, to people, to angels, to demons, to everything out there. All of the authority, all of the ruler, all of the leadership sees his greatness, the greatness of God, sees what he's like through you. How's that for a burden to carry? But it's not a burden. Because it's not what you do, it's what Jesus does in you and you allow him to do. It's when you say yes by faith that he is able to do these sorts of things within you. Next to the Trinity, according to the scriptures, and particularly Ephesians, you are the greatest thing in all creation. It's just a matter of allowing it to happen. It's already begun. It's already at work within us. Now it's just walking it out God's way. And the book of Ephesians is going to tell us not only why the church is so great, but now that we are part of it, how do we live? What should we be focused on? What should be our priorities? What should we be doing as individuals and even more importantly together? How should we be living? Got a secret for you. It's not going to be at all what you think. It's not going to be at all what you think. It's not going to be what we generally think about what makes a church great or not great. It's not going to be how we generally measure a fellowship of people. It won't be that. It won't come anywhere close to that. It will talk about far more important aspects from the heart of God that are life-changing to people if we'll step into them and by faith follow. Next to the Trinity,